This is your communication podcast with Teresa. Hey guys, so lovely to have you back for our discussion on ethics, and it's a really interesting discussion, and I'm sad to have to cram this discussion into 5 minutes, but let's go ahead. Yeah! Of course, when we are looking at ethics, we are chatting about whether something is right or wrong, good or bad, in a moral sense. And you already know that ethical decisions are quite idiosyncratic. What I mean by that is what you feel is right and wrong, good and bad, might not be what somebody else feels is right and wrong, good and bad. We have to distinguish between two major ways of looking at ethical decision making. There is the camp of the teleologists, and yes, you need to please say this word 3 times right now. Teleology, teleology, teleology. And then there are the deontologists. The deontologists approach ethical decision making from a duty perspective. Actually, this is a good way for you to remember. Deon starts with a D. So these are people who say ethical decisions need to be made based on the duty that you have to fulfill. For example, if you are a priest and somebody comes to you and has done something bad, maybe stolen a watch, then you would actually stick to your code of conduct as a priest and keep this secret for the person who has confessed to you. It is your duty. So therefore, your ethical decision lies in you sticking with your code of conduct. Yeah! If you are a teleologist, on the other hand, you are thinking about consequences. The consequences of your action. So coming back to the priest who has now heard the confession, if the priest decided to cast their duty aside, they would tell the police about the crime in order to avoid more crimes. So in this case, the priest had a consequentialist way of deciding whether or not to tell or what is good and bad. So teleology, whether an action is right or wrong, depends on the consequences of that action, whereas deontology looks at the duties of the participants in the action. Yeah! But remember, we always want to bring it back to our actual topic, and we are talking about persuasion. If you are persuading because it's your job, let's say you are a public relations practitioner, then obviously you don't really care about what's going to happen with your persuasion. For example, you wouldn't really care about the fact that people buy things that they actually can't afford. Whereas if you are a teleologist, you would say, hey, yes, I am a PRP, but I also need to look out for the people who don't have that kind of money and then maybe feel bad about themselves if they are confronted with my public relations message. Yeah! You can already hear from my examples. Persuasion can be quite unethical. I'm sure you have been confronted with adverts where you said, oof, I don't really trust what's going on there. Just think about the beautiful picture of a Big Mac on a billboard, and then you actually go to McDonald's and what you get looks nothing like the picture on the advert. So already we are talking about the ethical issue of lying in advertising, or exaggerating in advertising, or putting your best foot forward in advertising. Is it unethical to do so? Sure, false advertising is illegal. You shouldn't be able to do that. But we all know that advertisers take certain liberties and it's fine. And the reason why it is considered as okay is because you still have the choice. We're going straight back to our definition of persuasion. There is voluntary compliance. You're going along with the persuader because you decide to do it, which in essence, for many people, makes persuasion quite ethical. Yeah! For a quick summary, it is quite evident that persuasion can be used for ethical as well as non-ethical ends. Think about education as a persuasive technique. Obviously, there's nothing non-ethical or unethical about that. Whereas advertising can maybe sometimes be on the borderline. And then, of course, we have manipulation and blackmail, which are very unethical. I've also already pointed out that ethical decision-making really tosses you into a situation of 50 shades of grey. Relativity. Ethics, different from one person to the next. Ethics, different from one situation to the next. And that's what they mean by ethical issues are often relative. Sorry to bring up a rather negative example, but think about abortion. You might be completely against abortion for your own life. But what happens if somebody had been raped and therefore falls pregnant? Do you still think abortion is unethical? This is exactly the relativity that they are talking about. There's also a word of warning here when they say that there are certain unscrupulous practitioners. What they mean by unscrupulous is that people do not have scruples, or people do not have any kind of bad conscience if they are using persuasion in the wrong way. Coming back to the relativism that I've just mentioned, there are different ways to judge whether something is ethical or not. You could, for example, look at a situation from a legal perspective. So what does the law say? What does the regulation say? And you can mirror your decision-making or your judgment on that. You could also look for a religious guidance and say the scriptures tell me to behave in a certain way, and therefore this situation where maybe somebody used slander or talked about somebody negatively or with envy, that would be an unethical situation. You can also take a human nature approach. Basically, it just says something is ethical as long as the essence of human nature is preserved. For example, if you're invading somebody's space and you're not letting them talk, that would be an unethical thing to do under the human nature approach. And coming back to relativism, there is of course the situational approach as well, where you're judging ethical decision making based on the situation that you're confronted with. A few last little tidbits under this discussion. Ethical decision making is very much culture related. Remember, a culture is a group of people who share certain things. These could be abstract things like beliefs, attitudes, values, but these could also be very tangible things like food and dress and so on and so forth. The map of ethics of a culture is an abstract concept, but yes, certain cultures, for example the Muslim culture, would find it ethical to have multiple partners. Sure, so much to talk about and so little time. Guys, if there's nothing else that you took out of this, please know the difference between teleology and deontology. A teleologist thinks about the consequences, and the deontologist thinks about the duty in a situation where an ethical decision needs to be made. I hope you enjoyed it, Schnookies. Until next time, bye!